I really want to hear from the individuals who are joining this, joining our meeting, and to hear about their concerns and, you know, how we can. I can't deal with individual cases, but I certainly can write down your concerns and see how we can sort of mitigate some of these problems, because I continue to advocate on behalf of people with the DTC until they fix the problems once and for all.
Well, I'd be interested, like, I mean, I speak to a lot of different amounts of people, and no one knows about the disability tax credit. I mean, they have no idea. I don't know.
No, a lot of people are not familiar. It's really astonishing. And it's surprising that you'd think that medical offices should have a little brochure up on their bulletin board about the DTC, because I have a friend who has a severe walking problem. She's never heard about the DTC, but I've talked to her about the DTC for years, but she never realized that she might be eligible, because she now has a severe walking problem.
I did read the draft that you sent. May I say that?
No, absolutely.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was such a good read. And, you know, I have to say that it gave an idea of what it's like to live with somebody with bipolar disorder. My grandfather had that, and the whole family suffered. You know, he had 8 children, and the whole family suffered. So that in itself was just wonderful, but also the trouble you've been having with the CRA, I didn't realize that they were that problematic.
Oh my goodness, they're awful, and they're even worse now.
And you know, my problem was I couldn't get the psychiatrist to agree to fill out the forms. And I actually I took up to the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons, dug up what they sent me. I mean, he actually has a permanent record on his file because he didn't help me. But I'm going to send this to you.
Please do.
It's called the Third Party Reports, and it's from the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons. And it basically outlines what is expected of physicians. You know, that they have to be respectful. They have to communicate effectively. Yeah, so it's a real guide to physicians. And I don't know whether I'm going to have problems in the future, but, because your books have indicated that people will be asked again to apply. I didn't know that was a possibility.
Oh, yeah. No, and so I'm in Toronto for 2 meetings. So the second meeting is with we have a Disability Tax Fairness Alliance, and with the Canadian Mental Health Association, the national office. And my big concern is that the form for that was revised for 2022 is very discriminatory against people with mental impairments, and that if Canada comes out with this new Canada Disability Benefit, if they use the DTC as the gateway, well, we're just going to have thousands of people left behind. So I'm really fortunate that the policy director with the Canadian the Canadian Medical Association, who I've sort of emailed back and forth over the years, he is also going to be present by Zoom at this meeting, so that we get. My concern is that CRA is always saying that they're consulting with the doctors, but I can't find any records, and he can't find any records either so far of any consultation process. So the CRA is very good about lying. That's another issue. But anyway, so any information that anybody can send me, I'd really appreciate it.
You said that the first application, the doctor filled in the form, but the second time he did not fill out the form. Why was that?
Back in 1990, the doctor just had to state the diagnosis and give a little paragraph about the disabling effects of the bipolar disorder on Jim. But in 1995, CRA changed the form, and the question was, can your patient think, perceive, and remember? Well, I mean, you can be in a coma, and I believe people have been reported to be able to think. while they're in a coma. So the doctor had no choice. I mean, he said, of course, Jim can think. So he checked the yes box. But where it came to on the other page, whether Jim was markedly restricted in his mental functions, he also checked the yes box. So in a sense, he contradicted himself on the form. But at least I had a form. You cannot appeal to the Tax Court of Canada unless you have a form that the doctor has completed, whatever way he's completed, but has been denied by the DTC, but you have to have that form. So, and the CRA actually called Dr. Cook as a witness. And it turned out that Dr. Cook really didn't understand the legislation. And the judge decided, well, he didn't understand the legislation, but based on my testimony and his testimony also, that Jim qualified for the DTC. So it was a matter of the form had changed. Nothing had changed with Jim. And this is what's happening all the time. And now we're faced with 2021, we have one form. In 2022, we have another form. So, and yet the assessment tools for physical disabilities has remained more or less constant.
My son's psychiatrist didn't want to fill in the form, so the family doctor did it, but the second time the CRA wanted his psychiatrist to fill it out instead.
They don't have any right. A psychiatrist, a medical doctor, or a nurse practitioner can complete the form for mental functions. So they don't have a right to even ask that question. So I'm sorry, I find this absolutely appalling. Because here's the problem too with Dr. Cook, who was a psychiatrist. He had sent all of his patients, because all of his patients had bipolar disorder. He'd even sent the patients a letter stating that none of them qualified for the DTC under the terms of the Income Tax Act. Well, the judge took him to task for playing judge and jury. But this is obviously a real problem. I mean, this has come up several times now where I've been told a psychiatrist won't fill the form and they end up going back to the medical doctor. And then doctors are asking people to complete the form themselves and they'll just sign on to it. I mean, it's just getting, there are just so many barriers. So, I mean, it would be so nice if they didn't have all these barriers in terms of qualifying for the DTC, but CRA sets up these barriers and you're bound to fail.
So maybe some people may not know what the disability tax credit is. Can you just talk about it a little bit? And
so the disability tax credit we go back to the mid 80s, and it was essentially for people who were either in a wheelchair or were blind or confined to their bed. And I believe in 1889, around that period of time, legislation was passed to broaden the eligibility to all people with physical and mental impairments. So that brought in people with walking issues and dementia. And back then, they acknowledged that people with schizophrenia were eligible for the DTC, despite I'm sorry, I can't recall the exact language, but the doctors were sent a little booklet that provided them information about the DTC. And they certainly made a point of saying that people with schizophrenia were eligible. In 1995, the form changed again. And that's when we got to, can your patient think, perceive, and remember, which was ludicrous. And if you said no, then they would send a clarification letter. So quite often they send, this is called a clarification letter to the individuals. And it's a questionnaire. And back then the question was, what percentage of time could your patient not think, perceive, and remember? The magic number was 90. And unless you put in 90% or more, you didn't get the DTC. I mean, how ludicrous was that? But that's the way it was. And so they keep changing the goalposts and the criteria. And I mean, I was on the Disability Advisory Committee from 2019 to 2021 for 3 years, and we tried to get some improvements. But one of the sticking points is this 90%. The CRA wants to qualify the Income Tax Act that says that someone has to be markedly restricted all or substantially all the time, and that all or substantially all the time equals 90%. Now, if you go to my website, fightingforfairness.ca, and go into the justice section, and you go into the non-DTC cases, there are several cases where the judges have ruled in basically GST cases where you have where the mathematical model works, and allowing the DTC for anything from 75% up. So this 90% is just, again, it's a very restrictive barrier. Doesn't make sense because we don't have the mathematical tools for people with mental impairments. We don't have any way of measuring what they're thinking or how they're thinking. So it's always a fight to, but certainly I am hearing from more and more people when they fight back, they usually succeed. But it's a matter of fighting back. And these individuals are often so worn out by looking after their family members. And I can certainly feel for that. It's so easy to get discouraged. But fortunately, I had a husband who had a dogged determination that he was going to get it. And he just kept after me until, you know, I took care of the job but he always believed that I'd be able to resolve the issues. And fortunately, I've had a lot of people helping me, you know, with on this journey.
In the chat, someone asked a question. Can you explain the financial value of the DTC?
So I did get sidetracked.
Hold on. And is it worth all the effort?
Yes.
And how is it calculated?
So dollar value, it varies from province to province, but just looking at it from a very average point of view, it works out to about $1,300 to $1,800 back in taxes, in real money. So and you can go back up to 10 years. If you have the same doctor and the impairment was severe and prolonged throughout that period of time. So if you have a child with schizophrenia and you just found out about this DTC, then and child's always had the same doctor, or let's say the child has is on the autism spectrum, then you can go back 10 years. So that's big money. And we have a lot of companies who are helping people with their access to DTC who take 20 to 30% of the refund. But a lot of these people can't get it without assistance by companies, other companies who go back. And it's just like dealing with a legal issue. If it were that simple, then people could deal with it on their own, but it's not that simple. And certainly some cases are more complex than others. Now, the DTC has become a gateway to other benefits. So there's a child disability benefit. So if you have a child under, I believe it's 19, you get an extra $2,000 approximately a year. Also, if you're under 49, you're eligible to open up a registered disability savings plan. Even if you don't have an income, if you're on welfare or social assistance, you can still open up an RDSP. It's worth getting the DTC so you can open up an RDSP and just get the government grants. So bonds and grants, so the government will kick in $1,000 a year if you don't have an income. And if you have family members who can kick in a few dollars also, then the government will match these grants up to $3,500. And I have people who They've got to be close to $100,000 now with their RDSPs.
But how much does a person have to put in?
You don't have to put in anything.
Really? They
You
just
get at least $1,000 a bond if you don't put in anything, depending on you. But you get at least that much. But you can put in up to $3,500, I believe. So I'm not really the specialist on the RDSP, but it's a really good program because it's handled by the banks. Now, there was a time if you lost the DTC, if you had to apply for the DTC and you lost it, you no longer qualified. The government would go in there and claw back all their contributions if you come and close the RDSP on you. So this was a horrible, this is what I call in my book, the money heist. This was the most horrible thing that the CRA and the government of Canada concocted, that if for whatever reason you lost the DTC because the form was more restrictive or whatever, even though your disability would have been the same, the government could go in and claw back 10 years of contributions and then close the file. And then you'd have to pay income tax on any interest that you earned on your suddenly closed file. So we did resolve that problem a few years ago.
Do you have to be on the provincial disability plan?
No, you just have to be eligible for the DTC. You have to fill out a form. So you may not even have a taxable income, but you have to go and get the DTC form completed. And when the DTC is allowed, then you can go to the bank and open up an RDSP.
And in order to get the DTC, does the mentally ill person have to sign that application?
Yeah, they do ask for a signature on the bottom. I don't have the legal knowledge to know how you can circumvent that.
I've had a lot of difficulty getting doctors to fill out this form. Do you have any guidance on how to approach this?
That's why I'm really happy that Stephen Vail with the Canadian Medical Association will be, because that's the national, will be on this Zoom call and meeting with the Canadian Mental Health Association also. I mean, he has told me personally that this is the worst form for doctors to fill out. They all hate it. And certainly for physical disabilities, it's much more straightforward. But now we're in really treacherous waters, and that's why I must tell you, working on the memoir, I worked on it for almost 2 years, and the way it came about was when I turned 75, I wrote an essay, a personal essay, about how does one measure 75 years? And I went right back to Sweden in my pretty little dress that my mother had knitted, and my glasses. I had to wear glasses from a very young age, and sort of went through my life and piano lessons and both marriages and first husband and second husband and photos. And then people said to me, well, I want to read more. I want to hear more about your story. So then I started thinking, and I kept journals, and my husband kept everything, letters and his father's letters. So I quote from a lot of his father's letters and from Jim's own writings in my memoir. So I had a lot of material to work with. But the big, and it's really 2 books in one. It's living with a bipolar partner and the challenges. And it's the fighting CRA, and how the CRA over the years has just, every time you sort of it's like playing that child's game, giant step. Did you ever play it in the schoolyard? You take 1 giant step forward and 3 baby steps back and another foot forward. And this back and forth. And it's been back and forth like this for 30 years. And I'm tired, and I'm 77. My mother's going to be 99 next month. So, I may have a few more good years ahead of me, but I'm just hoping that my memoir will make other people so angry that they'll get in touch with their MP and tell their MP that this is wrong. That we have CRA is discriminating an entire class of citizens by making the test for eligibility criteria much harsher, with a much higher threshold than for people with physical disabilities.
Can we get a copy of the latest form? Would that be possible?
I can send it out. You know what? I'll send it to Joni and the form T2201. And Joni will distribute it to all of you. And go to my website, go to my last news alerts. I talk about the Likert scale and why this form has become very discriminatory. And you probably have all dealt with Likert scales, but don't know it. But a Likert scale is a measure of how much you like something. So if you filled out a survey that has from 1 to 10 or happy and unhappy or whatever, that's the Likert scale. And they have a very good one for physical impairments, and they have created, it isn't even a Likert scale for mental impairments. You have to have a very limited capacity and any one of 28 examples to qualify for the DTC now.
The doctor needs to know the patient, right? You just can't go to any doctor, right? The doctor has to have.
Yes, the doctor has to, obviously, the doctor has to have some knowledge of the patient.
So how does doctor?
So what I have done is I have created memos for people who, when they go to the doctor, and when you go to my website, I'm not even sure which page it is on, but it has a whole list of issues that qualify for the DTC. Okay. And the best thing to do is make it as easy for the doctor as possible in terms of the information to fill in the blank spaces on the form. Mm-hmm. And just write them out and provide that to the doctor.
What are your thoughts about the form having to be resubmitted every 5 years?
Well, this is another concern, that they want a new application every 5 years because they do not consider schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or even individuals on the autism spectrum to have a permanent disability. I mean, it's that ridiculous. So, and it just creates another barrier for people because their doctors change, and the biggest problem is that the form keeps changing. So the doctors, I mean, they're having a horrible time, I'm sure, trying to keep up with the form.
Do you have recommendations on consultants to help with the application?
So there is a company in BC. I will send Joni the information and she can decide what to do with the information. I do not want to broadcast anything on, because particularly since this is being recorded, but she'll have the name of a company that I certainly vouch for, who does a very good job helping people. And again, we're dealing with very difficult scenarios here. We're not dealing with a simple form that any doctor can complete. And whether it's walking or speaking or hearing. And you see even the irony is, even with so many doctors unwilling to complete the form for people with mental illness, the rejection rate is so much higher in that category than the other categories. You know, it's been close to 20%. Mm.
I know some people who have gone to some of the different consultants, and they have been able to get, it past, 5 or 10 years, money that they had no idea. And some people have gotten $50,000 and they get 20 or 30%. So that's
and the real tragedy. So the company that I'm talking about they take 20%. They're in BC. I wouldn't want to work with anybody who would take more than 20%.
20% of what?
Of the refund.
In year one.
For that particular refund, yes.
Or every year.
They don't take anything for future.
So that not every year for 5 years.
No, it's 1 year. The first
1
time
year.
you apply, you can go back.
And
But then that allows you, once you get it, that gives you access to the
that's right.
registered plan.
Then you're home free for at least
Yes.
5 years.
Yeah. And
But the other
rest of
thing
the
is
plan-
CRA has been trying to close down these businesses for the last few years. And in a very nasty way too. So they don't want anybody to be able to go to anyone for help. And this is, I mean, this is really, I'm shaking my head because it's so hard to actually believe how devious and downright nasty the CRA is. And I want to read just a small paragraph. So I'm reading it because it is not in my book. And it's not in my book because the agent for John Grisham never got back to me, because if I want to quote from somebody else's book, I have to get permission to do so. So it's not in my book, but I read The Rainmaker. I don't know if any of you have read The Rainmaker. And this is John Grisham's quote from The Rainmaker. I have been continuously astonished at the lengths to which wealthy insurance companies have gone to screw the little people. No dollar is too trivial to connive for, no scheme too challenging to activate. I've also been amazed at how few policyholders actually file suit. Most never consult a lawyer. And that's CRA. You know, there's no dollar too small to go after. And why do they target people with mental impairments? Because they don't have the strong advocacy groups that other organizations have. And most people with mental impairments can't advocate on their own behalf the way someone who's blind or who may be in a wheelchair is able to. And then there's the shame element. Let's not forget the shame element. A lot of families don't want to disclose that they have someone in their family with a mental illness. I mean, I'll tell you one really shocking story. I had the most wonderful surgeon who saved my life on the operating table back in December 1990, and discovered that I didn't have ovarian cancer. I had this other issue. But anyway, we got to know each other quite well because I was constantly having tests, and this is a cancer that likes to come back. So I've been on medication. I'm still on medication, thwarting its return. But she said to me, she knew about the DTC, and she said, "Do you think my son would qualify? Because he's really, he has ADHD and he's really having a lot of problems at school." And I said, "Well, quite possibly. I mean, you know, take the form and go to your doctor." And then I asked her a few months later, you know, if she filed a DTC. Her husband would not let her apply for the DTC because he didn't feel that his son was intellectually challenged in any way. I mean, what can I say?
I was just wondering about this 5-year renewal. If you're already in a registered plan, what happens if after 5 years you're taken off the...
You get to keep the plan.
You do?
You don't get any more government contributions unless you're DTC eligible.
Oh, yeah.
But you do get to keep the plan. The government is not going to get no longer can get their greedy hands in there. And back in, just trying to remember the year, but just a few years ago when they were still, in 1 year, they clawed back $25 million from people who lost the DTC. And those people probably should never have lost the DTC in any case. But when they requalified, they didn't get the DTC, and the government just went right in there and took back $25 million. And that's a lot of money when you split it up, you know, spread it out. So it's unreal how, like I say, I just hope my book gets people angry. angry like I have been. I mean, I'm a really nice person, and I don't swear too much and anything else, but boy, oh boy, I just, when people are hurting and people are being denied what's rightfully theirs, it's just, it's really hard to understand.
I'd always naively thought that the system was there to help, but there was always a barrier. I believe it's all by design.
It doesn't happen by accident. It's so devious that it is that when going back to when I went to tax court on my husband's behalf and the Federal Court of Appeal upheld the decision, within months, the CRA came out with a new draft form that basically took away that decision, because once you're in the Federal Court of Appeal, that's case law. All judges have to follow the ruling. So CRA tried to just pull the rug from under our feet. Thankfully, Carolyn Bennett was there, and we were able to get the Department of Finance to renege. But it's the Department of Finance that's calling the shots. It's not CRA, because anything to do with money is being controlled by the Department of Finance. I mean, Minister Labouthier is useless. I mean, she's there because she's useless. She doesn't create any issues.
Are you saying that if the DTC application is refused and somebody has a registered registered
the RDSP, Registered Disability Savings Plan,
then that is actually also, is that still vulnerable?
No, you can keep the RDSP.
But in the past though, that is actually the government took it back.
That's right. The government closed the plan and took back all its contributions in the previous 10 years.
But that's not happening now.
That's not happening now. Now, if you have the plan, you still have to keep the government contributions in there for 10 years. If you want to collapse your own plan, then the government will take back their money, because that's just the way that they're set up. But they can no longer close the plan and take the money out if you want to keep the plan open. So you can keep the plan open and continue to contribute yourself if you lose the DTC.
After the 10 years, you said you can keep it for 10 years. What happens? What can you do with it then?
Well, there's a formula in terms of how you take money out. So it's really designed for a long-term savings plan, just like our RRSPs are. If you try to collapse everything all at once, the CRA will tax whatever interest you've gained in the plan. So you don't want to sort of collapse it all at once. There's a formula in terms of how much money you take out every year. So you really need to have a specialist to deal with the nuts and bolts of these plans.
Thank you.
If there's a break in the questions, I did want to bring up something else, where the fact that you have a mental illness or a mental impairment, that does not keep you from earning income or keeping your job and still being DTC accessible. So people may think, well, if you have a job, how can you still and a mental impairment, how can you still be DTC eligible? So I have two cases, and they're both long-term employees, one with the provincial government and one with the federal government. And the employer provides accommodations because of both of them have bipolar disorder. And the employer provides accommodations so they continue to be able to keep their job. And most of them have a history of being on and off the job because of the symptoms of their illness. But we've represented them both to tax court, and they've both been settled out of court because because of their disability, their illness is severe enough to qualify. So, I mean, that's something to remember, particularly, let's say, for parents who have children with adult children with schizophrenia or autism spectrum, who are able to have a job where they're closely monitored, but at least they're earning an income. They may only work part-time. There's a young man who cleans tables for a large employer that has a employee cafeteria. He just cleans the tables and helps with the dishes and things like that. He's nonverbal, and the DTC, when they found out he was working, tried to yank in the CRA, tried to yank the DTC from him and his RDSP. And, you know, we appealed to tax court. And again, CRA does not want these cases appearing in court because they do not want the judges ruling favorably for individuals. So chances are they will want to settle out of court. So it's worth, you know, if you've gone through the internal appeal process and filed an objection to a decision against the DTC, then you can file a notice of appeal with the tax court. And again, I provide that information on my website. And chances are you'll never end up in court. Chances are that they will, it's called a consent to judgment, and they'll allow the DTC.
Is it an advantage to settle out of court?
You never want to go to court unless if there's no advantage to going to court if they're willing to settle. You're not going to get anything more in court.
Okay.
You're only going to get the year that's under review.
Can a family member apply for the DTC if they provide support for the mentally ill person?
So as far as I know, a sibling can, a sibling that's supporting someone else can apply for the DTC on behalf of that person if they can show that they are supporting them in some way. The CRA likes to have receipts for clothing and whatever. I feel that is an abuse of power on their part. There's nothing in the legislation and the Income Tax Act that talks about having proof of and most people, like I know of one mother who her son lives in a different home and he has his own home, but she provides him with meals, like Meals on Wheels. She brings him dinner, and how do you calculate the cost of dinner? But that's providing the support that they are talking about. Sure, it's nice if you have receipts, but who looks after a family member and keeps receipts in a drawer of every nickel and dime that they've spent on them? I mean, it's ludicrous even to think of that. And I would say that if CRA demands receipts, to just say in a letter that I'm sorry I don't have them, I'm too busy looking after whoever I'm looking after, and this is what I do for them. And there's nothing in the legislation that requires these receipts.
Do you think the CRA are discriminating against people with mental illness? Do you think basically the underlying motive of this is discrimination and stigma against people with mental illness?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a cash thing. I think it's a budget thing. I think they're so afraid because we keep hearing that 1 in 5 people in Canada will have a mental illness at some time or experience symptoms of mental illness at some time. I think they're just so terrified of opening the floodgates. I think it's just they're too cheap to provide. Now, you would never say that to people who are blind. Let's say thousands of people, for whatever reason, would lose their sight. become legally blind all of a sudden. Let's say the fires in Nova Scotia are causing blindness throughout the whole province of Nova Scotia. Do you think CRA would ever dare to change the eligibility criteria for blindness just because they have an onslaught of people coming on board? But that was the same thing when we filed the legal suit against Prudential. The lawyers for Prudential warned the judge that if he ruled in Jim's favor, he might be opening up the floodgates. The judge was very nasty about, he was not happy about being told how to rule in a case by the lawyer representing Prudential. But I think it's just, I think they're always terrible. And whether I don't believe in coincidences anymore, but I mentioned before that I was always fighting for children with diabetes, and going back that at least children whose parents couldn't afford the pump, that they would be able to access the DTC. And during our deliberations with the Disability Advisory Committee in recent years, I was pushing that all people with type 1 diabetes should be eligible. It's a very expensive illness. And initially, the tax credit was to offset some of the extraordinary expenses that you might have because of your illness, but they wouldn't qualify under the medical expense tax credit. So that's where the tax credit came into being. So with, suddenly I've lost my train of thought a bit. So with the diabetes, because there are always the expenses, whether you're paying for the pump or the syringes or whatever. So yes, CRA did make a major policy change in 2022 to allow all people with type 1 diabetes, children and adults in Canada, there's approximately 300,000 of them, make them eligible for the DTC if the doctor was willing to complete the form for them. Well, that's bringing like 200,000 potential extra people into the DTC program. What did they do in 2022? They made the restrictions much harsher for people with mental impairments. So if you have a winner, then there's got to be a loser. And we've been playing that seesaw game all along. Why does there have to be losers when there are some winners in this game of roulette? I mean, I talk about it in my book. It's a crapshoot. Why should it be a crapshoot to get the DTC? But that's almost what it's become for many people. I'm getting angry.
What are your thoughts on Carolyn Bennett and her role as the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions?
Yeah, I think Carolyn Bennett is she's dealing a lot with the addictions issues. I think that's pretty much dominating the portfolio. Yeah, she's always been a very caring person, and in my book, she's my hero. Yeah, but nobody runs their own show in that government, and in no government. It's always these decisions are made at the level of the Department of Finance. That's interesting. Yeah. And the bean counters.
One of the questions was that they wanted to know more about your personal life, Lembi, and so they want to know, you've been married, you have 2 children and grandchildren. Has any of your children or grandchildren have a mental health disorder? So
I've had a chat with somebody about this very subject today. We've been really fortunate. Both of our children, our son is 49, Jonathan, and Larissa is 47. They both are well, and I have 5 grandchildren, and they are all well. One of them has a little bit of OCD, and another one has a little bit of ADHD, and we certainly know that we believe that there is a genetic predisposition for bipolar disorder. Jim's mother probably had bipolar disorder and had ECT treatments going way back, but nobody ever talked about it because of the shame that was associated with mental illness. Her father was an alcoholic who had a very successful coal business at the time and never showed up at work because he was drinking all the time. So he was probably self-medicating along with one of her brothers. So this is a very common symptom. So yeah, it's I know of people. Jim's brother didn't have children, and I wonder if his brother didn't have children because it might have been afraid that there might have been some mental illness that's passed along. So yeah, it's that's tough. And like I say, we've been so fortunate that our children are well. And the other thing too, one more, now that we're on this bit of a topic, one of the people that I'm very concerned about is Gabor Mate, and you may know who I'm talking about. And I've heard him speak, and he has a new book, The Myth of Normal, and he doesn't believe in the genetic predisposition of mental illness, and he believes that it's something that's abused children or whatever.
Well,
Jim grew up in Forest Hill. You know, his father was a bank manager. His grandfather was president of the Toronto Stock Exchange. He grew up in a privileged family life. I mean, I grew up in the Woodbine district, blue collar area. Our backgrounds couldn't have been more different, but Jim was showing already, he probably had dyslexia and attention deficit disorder because Jim failed grade 1, grade 9, grade 1, grade 4, and grade 9. I mean, that would never happen today. And he was going to good schools, Upper Canada College, but I guess he never learned to read properly, but Jim is very resourceful and very bright and had carved out a very successful career for himself. So yeah, I find it very tragic for so many families who feel that they have to be blamed because they did something wrong with their children when they were growing up, or deprived them of love, or whatever it was. And that has nothing to do with this illness. We do better with unconditional love that we got from Jim's father, who was always there for me through some really, really tough times. I can probably say that without Jim's father, the marriage would never have survived because of the financial burdens that were there, plus the emotional issues. So it's unconditional love goes a long way. But certainly no parent should be. And I'm sure Jim's parents also wondered what they did wrong. I mean, they tried to do everything, give their son all the advantages. But he still ended up in the hospital. He still ended up needing ECT. Yeah, I really worry about Gabor Mate's book. Last time I checked, there were 194 holds for it at our local library. And I certainly don't want to make it sound like the world around us. I mean, we're affected every day by the world around us. And anybody living with PTSD, like my husband does now, because of being hit by a pickup truck when he was crossing the intersection in front of our building. But so we're all affected by our surroundings. And my husband blames me to this day for his manic episode. He said he was getting along just fine, a little bit too depressed most of the time. But when he met me, he was so excited, and it was just this perhaps delirium or whatever, that it's all my fault that he had a manic episode and it went off the rails. And of course, anytime that he might, I must say my husband and my children have been really terrific. My daughter had to sort of say, excuse me, Mom, but let's talk about something else sometimes, especially when I was carrying on about the DTC going back, but they've always let me do my thing. And I have to say that my husband is one of the courageous people I know to allow me to tell his story. And Kathy, who has read the book, knows how it takes someone really special who is more concerned about bringing our story to other families who may be experiencing many of the same issues that we are, and sharing our story with no holds barred. Whether it's the violence or the violent episode, unfortunately, there was only the one, but it's always been in the back of my mind. I mean, that never goes away. Or the freewheeling and free spending, and I'm sure I'll be criticized also for ostensibly letting my husband get away with everything. But as you all know, that we don't have that much control over other individuals either, regardless of how much we might love them or they love me. So I did want to say that my husband's very special in that sense, and he wanted me to tell the story. And where there were times where I really thought I can't do this anymore, he was the one who's kept encouraging me to forge ahead and get it done. Yeah, the one thing, I've been fortunate that my husband's always been medication compliant. My husband has a life. I mean, we've had children and grandchildren, and he's quite frank. He says he wouldn't be alive if he wasn't on medication, because he would do such crazy things. But also, in terms of talking about triggers, my hospitalization has always been a trigger. So it wasn't just that one cancer diagnosis, but I was back in the hospital a couple of years later, and he followed me. As I was being released, he followed me. He was back in the hospital a couple of days later. It's really, it's one of those things that we know, that my well-being is, his well-being is very dependent on my well-being.
Well, I think there's a difference between schizophrenia and bipolar, and with regards to medication.
Oh, absolutely. First of all, medications, people with bipolar do better with the choices that are there, like lithium. Of course, lithium is now creating other issues with my husband, which is kidney disease, because he's been on lithium for 50 years. And that's something that we are now have to contend with. But and also the cognition is a huge, there's a huge difference in terms of cognitive abilities, that people with bipolar disorder don't seem to lose their cognitive ability the way people with schizophrenia with various bouts of illness.
Well, I think
and I guess there's a better understanding of the importance of medications, even though medications, they're not 100%. In terms of my husband still walks around with a hypomanic mind, plotting and planning another trip, trying to, getting a little more difficult as we get older with more health issues. But 85%, 80%, 90%, I'll take whatever I can get.
In the hospital, the rights advisors play a role in telling patients that they don't have to take the medication if they don't want it.
It's a very cruel system. In BC at the present time, if you're hospitalized, you're medicated. That's why you're in the hospital.
Right.
So, but we do have our civil liberties groups who want to change that and bring in a similar system. System.
The BC Mental Health Act allows involuntary patients to have treatment. This therapeutic intervention is now being challenged in the courts by civil libertarians. In Ontario, the Ontario Mental Health Act does not have this therapeutic measure. So what happens is patients deteriorate while hospitalized, where the person can cause physical harm to themselves or others. There is a group called team made up of family members, police, lawyers, and psychiatrists, and led by a family caregiver out of the Kitchener area who are fighting to get the patient treated while his or her status is being reviewed.
And certainly my husband's after a manic period, I mean, he crashes and he's been suicidal and very depressed, and it's certainly very, very difficult. I can feel for everyone who's dealing with someone who is so depressed that they've just lost their will to live. There's so much tragedy out there, and I guess I'm so grateful that I have a husband who supported me in all the work that I've done and all the advocacy work that I've done, and allowed me to tell our story, because it's tough out there. It really is tough, and it's I had one person who wrote a little review after she read the book. She said that I was talking, she'd been there so many times and there were so many similarities to her story, and she just wanted to reach out and hug me so many times. And I just thought, you know, if my story can bring out those emotions, and it seems that it's enabling a lot of people to start talking about their family also more openly. And I think that's really important, because that's the only way that we discover that Joni has all this information about clozapine that I would like to get my hands on, and just sharing and networking is so important. We may not be able to fix all our problems all at once, but it's certainly drives us to keep at it until we do resolve the issues that are so important to us.
So one question is, how did, you know, your cancer diagnosis and treatment, and having your husband, you know, with his bipolar disorder diagnosis, how did that affect your kids growing up?
I shipped them off to boarding school when they were 12.
Seriously?
And, because we were living in Elliott Lake, and they really didn't have the same opportunities academic wise. And our son was a nerd. I mean, he didn't, you know, he couldn't skip or jump or play ball or anything else. So when they were 12, grade 7, our son went to Trinity College School in Port Hope, and Larissa went to Bishop Strong School in Toronto. One of the reasons I did send them, and I was able to do that because I had a successful manufacturing business at that time, and my husband was earning a decent income, was that I was always afraid in my deep down inside of my mind, you know, in terms of that even though Jim was always very stable and the children had never seen him, you know, never knew he had a mental illness until he was hospitalized when they were 12 and 14. It was always a fear in my back of my mind. He was very demanding of the kids, and, you know, wanting them to do well in school and that. And I was afraid those tensions might bring about other issues, re the mental health. So it was a fear element, and I was able to afford to do that. So the kids really, they both wanted to go. It wasn't as if they were forced out of the house or anything. And we've had very close relations. My husband had a heart event a couple of months ago, and our daughter's living in Switzerland, and she was here within 4 days. I mean, that's how deep the love is. And our son was here right away the following day. My husband almost passed away. We were very lucky that with being so close to the hospital, they were able to revive him. And so we continue on. But so we've always been very close family, even though we've been apart from a very early age. But that was, again, I mean, that was a decision that I made, and it was the right decision. And I guess living with a bipolar husband, I mean, he would have sucked up all the extra money that I made. So I made the decision that, you know, to give the children the education that I would have died for. Yeah.
So someone asked, because of the mania and spending, which one of their family member, their son is manic right now and racked up a lot of money on credit cards. Did you limit? Like, how did you control your husband? Did he?
We had separate finances. I couldn't control my husband. My husband at any one time would have had 10, 12 credit cards in his wallet. I had no control. And every time he'd be in the hospital and have a relapse, and the first time around, 1990, he was $65,000 in debt. I had to mortgage my house, and I paid off the debt, and he managed to rack it up soon after that again. My husband likes fine wines, so we do have a wine cellar beside me here, and I'm sure some of it is still sitting in there. Yeah, no, this is. I mean, I knew that this was going to be a problem early on, and we just kept our finances separate. So I didn't sign into, and he declared bankruptcy at one point too, and I was not a party to that. So yeah, that's a really difficult issue. If you can control the credit cards, it's a good thing to do, but in this case, I was not able to. So and yeah, Jim's parents had bailed him out also early on and many times, and they decided no longer to do that. So when we were in financial difficulty, the money would come to me, and I would make the decisions in terms of how to spend it, and dig ourselves out of debt. I mean, we had to dig ourselves out of debt many times. And when we moved from Elliott Lake to Toronto, Jim wanted to buy a co-op. I mean, we were in a financial position because of his long-term disability pension to do that. But I said, no, we're renting, because I was always afraid that if he ever had to declare bankruptcy again, we would lose our house. So we just rented, and we continue to rent.